The first round punched through the canopy 6 inches from Dennick's head, and Sergeant Moran didn't flinch. She was already moving, left hand on Corporal Dennick's vest strap, dragging him below the ridgeline, right hand cycling her weapons charge housing by feel, the way she'd done 10,000 times on ranges from Camp Harada to the dust-choked plateaus of Orvan III. The second round hit the rock shelf above them and sent a curtain of calcium shrapnel across her neck. She felt the sting, cataloged it, kept moving. "Contact front, 200 meters elevated position," she said into the squad channel. Not a shout, not even an inflection, the same tone she used to order coffee in the fob galley. Below her, the frontier town of Kesharath spread across the valley floor like a stain. Low-slung markets roofed with stripped hull plating, alleyways choked with cargo pallets and chemical drums, drainage ditches running brown with industrial runoff that stank of solvent even at this distance, the kind of place that existed on the margins of contested space, where 3 species traded in things none of them wanted customs agents to see: weapons-grade catalysts, unlicensed biomech components, people sometimes, though nobody called it that. The Kethari Provisional Government maintained a nominal customs post at the valley's northern entrance. It was staffed by 2 officers who clocked in every morning, drank imported stimulant tinctures for 8 hours, and clocked out without inspecting a single cargo manifest. Their salaries came from the provisional government. Their pensions came from the Syndicate. Everybody knew, nobody said. Moran had been in Kesharath for 11 days, watching the machinery operate. Her fire team herself, Dennick, Lance Corporal Tasev, and Private First Class Rook, had been attached to a coalition advisory element working the narcotics interdiction corridor along the Veshran-Kethari border. The advisory mission was officially diplomatic: observers, liaison personnel. The kind of soft mandate tasking that meant nobody back at fleet headquarters wanted fingerprints on whatever happened next, and nobody on the ground was expected to do anything that might produce fingerprints. What happened next was that Dennick's asset, a Kethari dock foreman named Sulen, had sent a burst transmission 14 hours ago. The Syndicate's primary distribution hub wasn't in the border zone at all. It was underneath Kesharath itself, 3 levels down, carved into the old mining tunnels that riddled the valley bedrock like a termite gallery. And tonight specifically, in roughly 9 hours, a shipment worth more than some planetary GDPs was moving through. Sulen had included coordinates, guard rotation schedules, a partial map of the tunnel network, and the names of 4 Syndicate logistics coordinators. It was the kind of intelligence package that interdiction operations waited years for. The kind that, if acted on within the operational window, could dismantle a network that had been moving product across 3 sectors for over a standard year. The advisory element's commander, a coalition major named Yortha Kethari himself, tall, angular, with the careful diction of career diplomacy and the polished scaling of someone who'd never worked a frontier post in his life, had declined to act. Jurisdictional ambiguity, he'd said. Insufficient force authorization. Political sensitivity regarding the Kethari Provisional Government, whose cooperation was essential for the advisory element's continued access to the corridor. He'd spoken for 11 minutes. Moran had counted. 11 minutes of words that all meant the same thing: not my problem, not my career, not my war. She'd listened to the entire briefing without expression, her hands folded on the table, her eyes on the surface of her cold stimulant cup. When Yorth finished, he'd looked around the briefing room, a converted storage bay with folding chairs, and a holographic display unit that flickered when the town's power grid surged, which was often, and waited for someone to agree with him. The 3 Kethari liaison officers nodded. The coalition intelligence analyst, a Veshran female whose job title contained the word coordination, and whose duties consisted primarily of filing reports that no one read, had already begun composing her shift summary. Nobody argued. Nobody would. Moran had stood, the chair scraped on the concrete floor. Every set of eyes in the room tracked the sound, the way prey animals track the click of a predator's claw. She'd walked to the equipment cage and drawn 4 sets of hardplate carriers, 6 additional magazines each, the field demolition kit that still had the manufacturer's seal on it, a portable data compression unit, and a handheld thermal imager. She'd also pulled a roll of det cord, 2 thermite igniters, and the field expedient chemical reference card from the demolition kit's documentation, sleeve a laminated card the size of her palm that listed volatility thresholds for 200 common industrial compounds. She'd read it while walking back to the fire team's quarters. She'd already known the relevant numbers. She read it again, because Moran didn't operate on memory when data was available. She'd set everything on the rack in the team's shared bay and started loading magazines, one at a time, methodical, each round seated by thumb pressure until the spring tension told her the magazine was full. Denik had looked at the gear, looked at her, and started loading his own magazines without a word. Tasev had checked the thermal imager's battery level. Rook had pulled out the terrain maps of Kesharath's eastern approaches and begun marking drainage routes with a grease pencil. Nobody had spoken. The team communicated the decision the way human fire teams always communicated decisions, through action. The conversation had happened in the equipment cage, in the sound of magazines being loaded, in the quiet arrangement of gear on the rack. Words were for people who needed to be persuaded. Moran's team didn't need persuading. They needed ammunition. Yorth had watched through the open door for a long time. He hadn't spoken. He knew what he was looking at. Everybody who'd served alongside humans long enough learned to read that particular silence, the moment when a human stopped talking and started preparing, and every other being in the room understood that talking was now irrelevant because the human had moved past the phase where talking could change anything. The Kethari had a word for it. Roughly translated, it meant the thing before the storm. They used it for weather, for artillery, and for human marines who'd made a decision. Yorth had used it in his personal log that evening, writing it in his native script. Moran found this out later during the investigation. She hadn't cared then either. She'd spent the remaining daylight hours walking the eastern approach. Alone, wearing civilian clothes and a wide-brimmed hat that obscured her face from the market district's scattered surveillance cameras. She'd memorized the ridgeline contours, the drainage channel gradients, the culvert dimensions, and the sightlines from every elevated position within 300 meters of the eastern town boundary. She'd bought a skewer of charred meat from a market stall and eaten it while standing at the culvert entrance, looking into the darkness of the storm drain the way someone might look at a door they intended to walk through later. The Kethari vendor who sold her the skewer would later tell investigators that the human woman had been completely calm, like someone checking a schedule. The reconnaissance had confirmed everything Sulin's map promised and added 3 details the map hadn't included. A second drainage grate at the culvert's midpoint that would require a body to compress through a gap designed for water, not humans. A Kethari observation post on the elevated rock shelf 300 meters above the eastern approach, staffed by at least 1 spotter with a long-range comm. And a motion sensor mounted in the drainage channel itself, which meant the approach wasn't unmonitored, it was simply unguarded. Because the Syndicate's operational planners had concluded that no force would use it for tactical entry. They'd concluded this because the drainage channel was too narrow, too steep, and too exposed to serve as an approach route for any species that couldn't maintain its footing on wet stone at a 40-degree incline while carrying 30 kilograms of combat equipment. For the Kethari, with their digitigrade feet and high center of gravity, this was a valid assessment. For the Drethanni, whose mass attraction ratio made wet stone a falling hazard, it was a certainty. For 4 humans, it was a sidewalk. Moran understood the drainage channel because she understood the Syndicate's operational psychology. The Syndicate thought in terms of species capabilities, what the Kethari could do, what the Drethanni could do, what the Veshran could do. They'd mapped the approach routes and assessed each one against the physical characteristics of every species that might conceivably launch an interdiction operation in this sector. The drainage channel had been dismissed because no species in their threat model could use it. The error wasn't in their analysis. The analysis was thorough, professional, and correct for every species they'd considered. The error was in their threat model. They hadn't considered humans. Not because they'd never heard of humans. The Syndicate operated across 3 sectors and employed or bribed members of a dozen species, and they were certainly aware that humans existed. They hadn't considered humans because humans were a statistical anomaly in the border corridor. The Coalition's advisory elements in the region were predominantly staffed by Veshran and Cathari personnel. Human Marines were assigned to advisory missions rarely, reluctantly, and usually as a compromise solution to staffing shortfalls that nobody wanted to acknowledge. The Syndicate's threat assessment reflected this. Human presence in the corridor was listed as negligible in the most recent security review that Sulan had included in his intelligence package. Negligible. The word would appear in the investigation report, highlighted, annotated, and preserved for posterity, as an example of what happened when you built your security model around species you expected and forgot about the one you didn't. Moran had briefed the team at 1600 hours, using the flat top of a cargo container as a makeshift terrain model. She'd laid out Sulan's map, overlaid her own observations, and walked through the plan in the clipped, sequential syntax she used for operational orders. Approach, entry, objective, contingencies, extraction. No speeches. No motivation. The team didn't need motivation. They needed timing, sectors of fire, and a shared understanding of the plan's logic, so that when the plan inevitably deviated from reality, they could adapt on the same wavelength. They'd moved out at 1730, while the market district was still busy enough to mask 4 people in civilian overshirts walking toward the eastern ridge. They'd cached the overshirts behind a rock formation at the ridgeline, donned their plate carriers, conducted a final communications check, and begun the approach. Now she was 300 meters above the town's eastern approach, taking fire from the observation post she'd identified 6 hours earlier. The Syndicate knew someone was coming. They'd known since the 2 customs officers had failed to report a routine all-clear at their scheduled interval, because Moran's team had passed through the customs post without incident, but Tasev had clipped the building's external antenna on the way past, and the officer's automated check-in had bounced. A small thing. But in a place like Kesharath, small things were noticed by people whose business was noticing. They didn't know it was 4 humans. 4 was a number that didn't compute in the Syndicate's threat calculus. 4 meant a scout element, maybe, or a forward observation team that would call in a larger force. 4 didn't mean an assault. 4, to a Drethanni reaction force commander who measured strength in multiples of 12, meant nothing at all. Tasev suppression. Denik bound left to the drainage channel. Rook, stay on me. She spoke the way she moved, compressed, efficient, with nothing wasted on emphasis. Each word was a coordinate on a map she'd already drawn in her head hours ago, walking the terrain in the dark, memorizing the drainage paths and the angles and the dead ground where a body could move unseen. Tasev opened up from his position 40 meters south. 3 round bursts, aimed at the lip of the elevated platform where the shooters had positioned themselves behind corrugated hull plating. The bursts weren't meant to kill. They were meant to make the shooters pull their heads down and think about their life choices for the 6 seconds Denik needed to cross the exposed ground and drop into the concrete drainage channel that fed rainwater from the ridge into the valley. 6 seconds. Denik made it in 4. He'd always been fast. Not fast in the way that Drethanni were fast, explosive, overpowered, burning through their adrenal reserves in a burst that left them winded after 30 seconds. Fast in the way humans were fast, sustained, economical, a body designed to cover ground for hours without stopping. Moran watched through her optic. The reticle held steady on the platform despite the weapon's weight, despite the angle, despite the fine muscle tremors that accumulated in any sustained hold longer than 30 seconds. Humans had a trick for this, not a trick, exactly, but a physiological capability that other species' marksmanship doctrines considered impossible. They could maintain a precision hold by managing their breathing cycle, pulse timing, and skeletal alignment simultaneously, creating a stable firing platform out of a biological system that was, by any engineering standard, absurdly imprecise. Bones connected by flexible cartilage, muscles that fatigued and twitched, a heartbeat that introduced a rhythmic perturbation into every aiming system the body tried to construct. Any sensible species would have looked at the human musculoskeletal system and concluded that precision marksmanship was physiologically impractical. Humans had looked at the same system and said, yes, but what if we practiced for 10,000 hours? And the answer had turned out to be a species that could put a round through a 2-centimeter gap at 200 meters while lying on rubble in a crosswind. The shooter's position went quiet under Tasev's fire, then resumed from a slightly different angle, shifted left, lower. 2 shooters then, or 1 shooter and a spotter who'd picked up a weapon. She filed it. Denik, you have eyes. Affirmative. 2 warm bodies, elevated platform, corrugated cover, no armor signature. One has a long-range comm unit clipped to his harness. He's been transmitting since we made the ridge. Active relay. Every second that comm unit operated was another second the hub below had to reinforce, relocate, or start destroying evidence. The operational window was shrinking. Take the one with the comm first. Tasev shifts to the second. On my mark. 3-2 mark. 2 shots, 1.5 seconds apart. The comm operator pitched sideways and the relay unit went with him, its transmission cutting to static mid-syllable. The second spotter tried to flatten himself behind the corrugated plating, but Tasev's round found the gap between the plating and the platform's support structure. He slumped, and the elevated position went dark. Moran tracked the platform through her optic for 3 seconds after the shots, watching for any sign of additional personnel or automated systems. Nothing moved. The platform was cold. Relays down. We've bought ourselves a window maybe 5 minutes before someone at the hub notices the check-in stopped. Move. They flowed down the ridgeline in a staggered column, spacing maintained by instinct and by the kind of muscle memory that took years of shared deployments to develop. Each member of the team knew where the others were without looking, the way a flock of birds knows the geometry of its formation without counting. Rook kept pace behind Moran, his breathing controlled, his weapon up. He was the youngest of the 4, 22 standard years, but he'd been with the team since the Vashran corridor sweep 8 months ago, and in those 8 months he'd unlearned the parade ground habits of his basic training and replaced them with the economy of movement that separated Marines who survived from Marines who didn't. The drainage channel was steep and slick. Condensation from the valley's thermal differential coated every surface in a film of mineral-laced water that made the stone gleam in the low light. The channel had been cut into the hillside decades ago by Cathari civil engineers who'd cared about flood control and hadn't anticipated that it would one day serve as an infiltration route for a Deathworld species that could run on wet stone at a dead sprint without losing its footing. Moran's boots gripped the surface with the mechanical reliability of an organism that had evolved on a planet where 70% of the surface was water, and the other 30% was trying to kill you in a variety of creative ways. She didn't think about traction. She thought about the next 30 meters. Halfway down, Rook tapped her shoulder. Sensor cluster, bolted to the channel wall at knee height, its indicator light pulsing amber. Cathari commercial-grade motion detection, warehouse perimeter security, designed to trigger an alert when something larger than the local vermin crossed its field. The sensor had already seen them. The alert had already been sent. The Syndicate's guard force at the tunnel junction now knew that something was coming down the drainage channel, and they'd had roughly 90 seconds to prepare. Moran studied the sensor for 2 seconds. She ran the implications. The guard force would reinforce, orient toward the drainage entry, and set an ambush at the junction. They would expect their targets to slow down, to approach cautiously, to probe the junction and try to identify the defensive positions before committing. That was the textbook response. It was also the slow response. They know we're in the channel, pace up. We're past the point where stealth buys us anything, speed buys us more. She broke into a controlled run, her team matching pace behind her, the column descending the drainage channel at a speed that would have been reckless for any species that didn't have the proprioceptive feedback system of a persistence predator, the ability to feel the terrain through the soles of the feet, process the data through the spinal cord before it reached the brain, and adjust the next footfall accordingly. Humans didn't think about running on difficult terrain. Their bodies ran the calculation below the level of conscious awareness, the same way their bodies regulated heartbeat and blood pressure, and the conscious mind was freed to focus on more important things like the 6 armed hostiles waiting at the bottom. They ran, 4 humans moving through a drainage channel at a speed that would be documented in the after-action report as rapid tactical approach, and would be described by the Syndicate's surviving personnel as something coming down the channel like water. The distinction between the two descriptions was the distinction between the language of the species that produced Moran and the language of the species that had just discovered what Moran's species could do in a drainage channel at sunset. Denik was first to the bottom, his boots hitting the culvert floor with a controlled impact that used the drainage channel's gradient to convert downhill momentum into forward speed. Tasev followed 3 meters behind, his weapon tracking the channel walls. His eyes adapted to the deepening gloom with the casual efficiency of a visual system that had spent its evolutionary history operating in environments where the light changed every time a cloud passed over the sun, every time the canopy shifted, every time a predator's shadow fell across the trail. Rook brought up the rear, his breathing controlled, his pace matching the column's rhythm, the spacing between each team member maintained by instinct and by the 1,000 small calculations that a human body performed every second without consulting the conscious mind. The channel emptied into a culvert at the town's eastern edge. The culvert was chest-height, round, built from reinforced concrete sections that had been joined with weathered sealant that was cracking in places and oozing a dark mineral slurry. It smelled of standing water, mineral deposits, and the faint chemical residue of whatever industrial runoff the town's processing facilities drained into the system. Moran noted the chemical smell. It was different from the narcotics odor Sulen had described, lighter, more acidic, consistent with the metalworking shops in the market district. The narcotics smell would come later, deeper, where the storm drain connected to the mining tunnels. The culvert fed into a storm drain wider, taller, the walls rough-cut stone with periodic drainage grates set into the floor. At the second grate, Moran held up a fist and the column stopped. She examined the grate. It was designed to filter debris from the drainage flow, but someone had modified it. The central bars had been cut and re-welded to create a gap wide enough for a body to pass through if that body compressed itself sideways. The modification was recent, the weld marks still bright. Someone used this passage regularly. Probably Sulen, possibly other Syndicate personnel who needed to move between the town and the tunnels without using the official access points. She went through the gap first, turning sideways, compressing her shoulders, sliding her plate carrier through with the practiced contortion of someone who'd spent an evolutionary lifetime fitting into spaces that weren't designed for her. Humans were uniquely good at this, at contorting, compressing, squeezing through gaps that should have been too small. It was a consequence of having a flexible rib cage, rotating shoulder joints, and a skeletal structure that prioritized adaptability over structural rigidity. Most species' bodies were optimized for one type of movement. Humans' bodies were optimized for all of them, with the understanding that none of them would be done particularly elegantly. The storm drain connected to the second sublevel of the mining tunnel network. The entry point existed in the administrative space between jurisdictions. Technically, the town's infrastructure department was responsible for the storm drain. Technically, the mining commission was responsible for the tunnel access. And in practice, neither body wanted to claim ownership of a passage that connected a legitimate civic drainage system to an underground facility whose existence they were both paid to ignore. Moran held at the storm drain's terminus, where the drainage channel widened into the first tunnel access chamber. The air temperature dropped 3 degrees in the space of 2 meters. The walls changed from poured concrete to rough-cut limestone. The sound changed too. The ambient hum of the town's surface activity faded and was replaced by the hollow, directionless acoustics of a subterranean space where sound bounced off stone walls and arrived at the ear from multiple directions simultaneously. Humans, whose auditory system was designed for environments where sound was routinely distorted by terrain, vegetation, weather, and the general acoustic chaos of a Deathworld's biosphere, processed it without difficulty. Her pupils dilated, the irises contracting to thin rings around deep black centers. Human eyes adapted to light changes in approximately 8 seconds. Most species needed 40 or more. In those 32 extra seconds of functional darkness, a human could cover 60 meters, identify threats, and make decisions that the opposing force was still too blind to know were happening. It was one of the Deathworld's quieter advantages, not dramatic, not cinematic, but in a dark tunnel it was the difference between seeing and not seeing, and in combat the difference between seeing and not seeing was the difference between everything. Thermals. Rook passed the handheld unit forward. She swept the tunnel. Cool stone, residual heat from drainage flow, and 60 meters in, a cluster of warm bodies at the junction. 6. Not the 4 that Sulin's rotation schedule had predicted. The sensor alert had prompted reinforcement. 2 additional guards had moved to flanking positions on either side of the approach corridor, and the remaining 4 had shifted into cover positions behind tunnel support structures. They were set up to catch an approaching force in a crossfire at the junction's narrowest point. It was a competent ambush. It would have worked against a force that approached at a walking pace, using illumination, announcing itself through the normal sounds of movement that tunnel acoustics amplified into useful intelligence. Moran's team wasn't going to approach at a walking pace. She handed the unit back and gave hand signals. 6 targets, 2 flanking left and right, 4 center behind cover. Denik takes the left flank. Moran takes the right. Tasev and Rook center. Engagement on her initiation. Speed is everything. They moved, not in a rush, not in a creep, in the particular pace that combat veterans used when they knew the fight was coming and wanted to arrive at it with their heart rates low and their weapons indexed to the threat. It was a pace that looked slow until you measured the distance covered, and then it looked fast, and then you realized it wasn't either. It was efficient, which was the thing that human Marines optimized for above all else. Efficiency. The maximum result for the minimum expenditure of energy, time, and ammunition. The universe's most effective predator didn't waste. Single file for the first 30 meters, the tunnel walls close enough to brush with an extended elbow. Moran on point. The stone under her boots was uneven bore-cut limestone with ridges left by industrial cutting heads that had carved these tunnels for mineral extraction, not for foot traffic. The ridges were ankle turners for species that walked on digitigrade limbs or toe claws. For a human, with flat, flexible feet evolved for crossing every terrain their planet's sadistic geology could produce, the ridges were traction. Her footfalls made almost no sound, not because she was trained in silent movement, though she was, but because humans walked with a heel-strike gait that distributed impact over a larger surface area than the toe-claw locomotion most species used. The acoustics of human footfall were lower frequency, harder to distinguish from ambient tunnel noise, the drip of condensation, the hum of distant machinery, the low vibration of the town's power grid transmitted through the bedrock. It wasn't stealth, it was physics. At 40 meters she heard them. Cathari voices in the clicking border dialect, sharp with tension. Underneath that lower, Drethanni, the guttural back-and-forth of a language built for dominance displays and territorial assertion. At least 2 of the 6 were Drethanni contract soldiers, reptilian, heavy-framed, scaled in dark green-black plates that served as natural light armor, pit-bred, violent by profession and by neurology. At 20 meters, she could make out their positions. 4 Cathari with civilian-grade pulse carbines, holding cover behind tunnel supports, their postures rigid with the anxious energy of beings who were security guards by employment and prey animals by evolutionary history. And 2 Drethanni, broader, calmer, standing with the coiled gait of organisms whose entire physiological architecture was optimized for one activity, killing things in enclosed spaces. The Drethanni carried military-grade weapons, contract arms. The equipment that came with the contract, paid for by the Syndicate, maintained to Drethanni combat standards. The Cathari were afraid. Moran could read it in the way they held their weapons too tight, the muzzles drifting, the grip tension producing the micro-tremors that degraded accuracy by centimeters at close range and by meters at distance. Fear made muscles tighten. Tightened muscles lost the fine motor control that separated aimed fire from noise. The Cathari guards were already less dangerous than their weapons suggested, because their bodies were betraying them in the small ways that fear always betrayed prey species when the predator was close. The Drethanni were eager. They stood with the coiled readiness of organisms whose combat physiology was already ramping up, pupils dilated, respiratory rate elevated, the deep body heat signatures on the thermal imager running hotter than baseline as their adrenal systems preloaded the neurochemical cocktail that would carry them through the engagement. Drethanni combat conditioning was built on a simple principle: when threatened, attack; when uncertain, attack; when outnumbered, attack harder. It was the philosophy of a species that had evolved in fighting pits and exported its warriors across 3 sectors on the strength of that reputation. In the pits, it worked. In open-field engagements against species that fought on the same neurochemical terms, it worked. Against a species that didn't fight on neurochemical terms at all, that fought on geometric terms, on temporal terms, on the cold mathematical terms of angles and distances and probabilities, calculated by a brain that remained fully functional, while the body around it performed violence, it was a liability. Neither was prepared. 3 fingers down, 2, 1. The junction broke open. Moran's first round took the right flank Drethanni through the joint gap under his weapon arm, where the dark scales thinned to vulnerable tissue. He twisted, tried to bring his weapon around, and her second round finished the rotation permanently. Dennick's shots were almost simultaneous. The left flank Drethanni went down in 2 impacts that echoed off the stone walls like hammer strikes. Tasev and Rook collapsed the center. 3 of the 4 Cathari broke immediately. They dropped their weapons, hit the ground, and assumed postures that every species in the galaxy recognized as surrender. The 4th fired blindly into the ceiling, a panic response that accomplished nothing except identifying his position for Tasev, whose single answering round removed him from the engagement with clinical finality. 14 seconds from initiation to silence. The engagement had lasted less time than the Cathari Guard commander's shift briefing, less time than the Drethanni contract soldiers' pre-deployment equipment check, less time than it took to read the after-action paragraph that would describe it. 14 seconds. In that span, 4 humans had entered a prepared defensive position held by 6 armed combatants with positional advantage, numerical superiority, and advance warning, and had dismantled it with the mechanical precision of a maintenance crew removing a faulty component from a machine professionally, completely, and without any particular emotional investment in the process. The tunnel smelled of ozone and the acrid bite of pulse weapon discharge. Smoke curled from the impact craters on the stone walls, small, precise wounds in the limestone, each one the signature of a round that had gone exactly where it was intended to go. Moran stepped through the junction, weapon up, scanning the space with the systematic thoroughness of someone who'd learned that silence and clear were not synonyms. She checked bodies. Drethanni first, because Drethanni had been known to absorb rounds that would have killed most species and still manage one final act of violence before their nervous system accepted the situation. Both were done. The placement had been precise enough to ensure finality. 2 Drethanni dead. 1 wounded, crawling toward the south wall, leaving a trail on the stone. 1 kneeling, hands flat on the ground, shaking so hard that his scales clicked against each other like dice in a cup. She looked at the kneeling one, young, barely adult by Drethanni standards. His weapon was 3 meters away, abandoned. Rook, secure him. Zip his wrists, walk him to the culvert entrance, leave him. Denik, field dress the wounded one. Stop the bleeding, nothing more. He's Syndicate personnel, Sergeant. He's a conscript with a pulse carbine and no body armor. He's not Syndicate, he's labor. Dress the wound. Denik dressed it. 30 seconds of clinical, efficient first aid, a pressure bandage from his kit, applied with hands that had done this enough times to treat it as mechanical rather than medical. The wounded Drethanni watched him with an expression that combined pain, fear, and something that might have been confused gratitude. In his experience, the people who just shot you didn't usually stop to bandage the ones who survived. But Moran's team operated on a different logic. They killed threats, they treated casualties, they documented everything, and they never confused the three. They moved south, deeper into the mining network, toward the sound of machinery and the chemical smell that grew thicker with every meter. The main excavation gallery opened before them like the interior of a cathedral built by people who worshipped industry rather than gods. The ceiling was 7 meters up, supported by limestone pillars spaced at regular intervals. Overhead lighting, retrofitted chemical blue panels wired directly to the town's power grid, cast uneven pools of illumination that left stretches of near darkness between them. The air was different here, thicker, warmer, laden with the sharp, acrid sweetness of processed narcotics, a chemical tang that coated the inside of Moran's throat and settled into her sinuses like a film. The hub. It occupied the gallery's western chamber, separated from the main corridor by a barricade of stacked cargo containers, industrial shipping units, each 3 meters long, arranged in a defensive line that served simultaneously as workspace, barrier, and inventory storage. Behind the containers, the operation was in full swing. Figures moved between processing stations. Centrifuges hummed at operational speed. Filtration arrays cycled cloudy liquid through graduated membranes. Chemical baths held open containment trays of solvent-stage precursor, 60 liters of volatile material kept in open trays, because the refinement process required controlled atmospheric exposure at a precise oxygen concentration. Atmospheric regulators, bolted to the walls at intervals, maintained that concentration to a tolerance of 0.5%. The margin between productive chemistry and catastrophic ignition was exactly as wide as 4 small humming machines made it. Moran counted through her optic, 18 visible, 10 Drethanni enforcers' sidearms, light vests, positioned around the perimeter in loosely defined postures of beings whose job was to look armed rather than to be competent, and 8 Drethanni. The Drethanni were the real defense. They wore purpose-built tactical harnesses with integrated weapon mounts, their dark-scaled bodies moving through the hub with the proprietary confidence of beings who considered this space their territory, and everyone in it their property. 3 of them carried heavy repeating weapons, belt-fed, crew-served grade, mounted on stabilized harnesses that distributed the weight across their broad torsos. The kind of hardware that could suppress an entire approach corridor, and turn an infantry advance into an infantry obituary. 3 heavies. That was the problem. A single Drethanni heavy repeater fired 1,800 rounds per minute at a muzzle velocity that could penetrate light vehicle armor at 300 meters. In the confined acoustics of the gallery, the sound alone would be disorienting, a physical assault on the auditory system that most species experienced as pain. The weapon's recoil was managed by the stabilizer harness, which distributed the force across the operator's torso, allowing sustained fire without the accuracy degradation that recoil induced in handheld weapons. A single heavy repeater, properly positioned, could control a 60-degree arc and suppress any approach through sheer volume of fire. 3 of them, covering overlapping sectors, turned the gallery into a kill zone that extended from the container barricade to every entrance point. A frontal assault against 3 emplaced heavy weapons in a confined underground space was the kind of engagement that appeared in training manuals under the heading, "Situations to Avoid." It was the kind of engagement that produced posthumous commendations, institutional reviews, and case studies in what not to do that were taught to officer candidates for decades afterward. It was the kind of engagement that a force of 40, with supporting fire and breaching equipment, might attempt if the tactical situation demanded it, and the command authority was willing to accept 20% casualties as an acceptable cost of the objective. Moran had 4 people and no supporting fire. She also had no intention of accepting any casualties, because casualties implied a failure of planning, and Moran's plans did not fail. They adapted. They adjusted. They found the seam in the problem and exploited it with the focused precision of a surgical instrument. Moran didn't plan frontal assaults. She planned sequences, ordered chains of actions where each step created the conditions for the next, the way a surgeon planned an operation. This cut enables that access exposes the target is addressed, the wound is closed. No step existed in isolation. Taste of South Access, the heavies. I see them, processing station far corner, west wall by the cargo lift. And one walking the container perimeter. He completes a circuit every 90 seconds. Walking one first. He passes behind the northwest pillar in 40 seconds. When he's behind it, he's out of line of sight from the other 2. That's your window. 2 seconds, maybe less. Then shift to the west wall. I take the processing station. Copy. Denik, you and Rook enter from the south gallery access on 30-second offset. Crossfire, left to right, Kethari targets. Watch your backstop. The chemical baths are behind the processing station, and they'll burn if you put a round into them before I'm ready for them to burn. Understood. 30 seconds from Mark. She settled her weapon against her shoulder. The stock fit the pocket of her collarbone with the familiarity of her own skeleton. Mark. The human body, under trained control, could regulate its own combat physiology with a precision that most galactic species found difficult to believe and impossible to replicate. Where a Drethanni's adrenal system flooded its bloodstream with an undifferentiated cascade of combat stimulants, spiking aggression, reaction speed, and pain tolerance at the cost of fine motor control, judgment, and the ability to stop fighting once started, a human marine's cortisol and adrenaline response was a calibrated instrument. Enough neurochemical activation to sharpen visual acuity, accelerate reaction time, and enhance peripheral awareness. Not enough to degrade the millimeter-level precision of an aiming hand. Moran's heart rate was 74. Rook's was 68. Younger cardiovascular system, the resting efficiency of a body that hadn't yet accumulated the micro-damages of a decade of field deployment. Denik's was 79. He ran slightly higher under operational stress, always had, a trait his medicals noted as elevated but within acceptable operational parameters. Tasev's was 62, and had been 62 during every engagement Moran had ever observed him in, and would probably be 62 during his own funeral if he were somehow conscious for it. The man's autonomic nervous system appeared to have been manufactured in a factory that produced precision instruments. Moran's had been 72 when she'd left the advisory compound 3 hours ago. The 2-beat increase represented the total physiological concession her body had made to the fact that she was about to initiate a firefight against a numerically superior force in an enclosed underground space. 2 beats per minute. That was what the Deathworld had built. An organism whose stress response was measured in single digits, whose hands remained steady at the precise moment when steadiness mattered most, and whose conscious mind remained clear enough to track 18 targets, 3 heavy weapons, 90-second patrol cycles, and a 30-second countdown simultaneously. The walking Drethanni completed his circuit. He passed behind the northwest pillar. Tasev fired. The sound was a single compressed bark, absorbed by the gallery's limestone walls before the echo could form. The walking Drethanni folded and went down behind the pillar dead before anyone in the hub registered the shot, hidden from view by the pillar that had been his cover and was now his grave marker. Tasev shifted. The west wall gunner was turning not toward the pillar because he hadn't identified the threat axis yet, but toward the south gallery entrance, where some instinct or some flicker of motion had drawn his attention. Tasev's second round caught him in the collarbone gap above the tactical harness. The heavy repeater tipped off its mount and crashed into the cargo lift mechanism with a sound that the entire hub heard. Moran fired. The processing station gunner was fast. He'd started moving at the sound of Tasev's second shot, pivoting, dropping behind the bulk of his own weapon, trying to bring the heavy repeater's barrel around to bear on the west entrance. He was good. He was trained. He had the reflexes of a pit-bred soldier and the instincts of a predator species with 8 million years of evolutionary pressure behind every muscle twitch. Moran shot him through the gap between the weapon's receiver housing and the stabilizer harness. He fell across the belt mechanism. She fired again, confirming. 3 heavy weapons down in 5 seconds. The hub's primary defensive capability was gone before the men operating it had fully processed that they were under attack. The remaining 5 Drethanni reacted the way their conditioning demanded. They charged, not toward cover, not toward exits, toward the fire. Their war cries filled the gallery with the deep, atavistic bellows that Drethanni pit culture used as both adrenal trigger and psychological weapon, a sound engineered by evolution and refined by training to paralyze prey species with a frequency-specific fear response that overrode voluntary motor control. Humans were not a prey species. The bellows washed over Moran like background noise. The first Drethanni came over the container wall in a vaulting leap. Moran tracked his arc and shot him at the apex. The second was right behind, faster, smarter, using the first one's body as momentary cover. She shifted and fired twice. He dropped mid-stride. From the south access, Rook and Denik entered the crossfire. The third Drethanni took rounds from 2 directions simultaneously and went down in the open. The fourth made it behind a support pillar and began firing from cover, short, aimed bursts that showed real training. He was the dangerous one, not because he was bigger or faster, but because he was thinking. He'd seen 3 of his fellows die in a crossfire, and he'd chosen cover over aggression, which meant his conditioning was subordinate to his judgment, which meant he was the most competent fighter in the hub. Moran marked his position. She settled into the patient stillness that was the human predator's oldest weapon, the ability to wait while the prey moved. His pattern resolved. Burst, pause, microshift left behind the pillar, burst again. The shift exposed him for a quarter second. Moran needed less. She fired during the shift. He went down behind the pillar. The 5th Drethanni went for the cargo lift. Not to escape, to descend, to reach the lower tunnels, to summon the reserve force that Moran knew existed somewhere in the deeper network. Denik. 1 shot. The 5th Drethanni hit the lift housing and didn't get up. The Cathari enforcers had dissolved. Some were flat on the ground with their hands clasped over the back of their necks. Others had retreated behind cargo containers. Two had thrown their weapons into the open space between the container barricade and the gallery floor. One was running south, toward the deeper tunnels, his footsteps echoing in the gallery like a fading heartbeat. Rook tracked him through his optic but didn't fire. A running man was a non-threat, and the objective wasn't body count. The hub was theirs in under 70 seconds. 8 Drethanni contract soldiers neutralized every one of them, because the Drethanni didn't surrender and Moran's team didn't miss. 5 Cathari enforcers neutralized 4 dead, 1 wounded. 3 Cathari fled south into the tunnel network, where they would either find the reserve force and deliver intelligence that was already outdated by the time they arrived, or they would keep running until they reached an exit and never come back. 0 friendly casualties. 0 rounds wasted. Every shot accounted for in the mental ledger that each member of the team maintained automatically. The way their cardiovascular systems maintained blood oxygen levels, not because they thought about it, but because they were built to track it. Moran's heart rate was 75. She ejected her magazine, checked the round count by weight in her hand, 7 remaining, and seated a fresh one from her vest carrier. The motion was automatic, performed without looking, the way a musician changes a string during a performance. The hands know the task and the mind is already somewhere else. The somewhere else was the clock. Moran's internal time sense, the chronometric awareness that combat training had grafted onto an already precise biological clock, told her that the operation had consumed approximately 12 minutes since the ridgeline contact. 12 minutes. In that time, her team had engaged and neutralized an observation post, descended a drainage channel, infiltrated a subterranean tunnel network, cleared a guard junction defended by 6 armed hostiles, and assaulted a processing hub held by 18 combatants, including 8 Drethanni contract soldiers with crew-served heavy weapons. 12 minutes. The Syndicate had spent over a standard year building this facility, staffing it, establishing its supply chains, integrating its operations into the legitimate economy of 3 allied governments. 12 minutes to build the case that would dismantle all of it. The asymmetry wasn't accidental. It was the product of a species that had spent its evolutionary history compressing complex operations into short, decisive windows of action, because on a Deathworld, windows closed quickly and permanently. Sulan's intelligence estimated the Syndicate maintained a reserve force in the lower tunnel network, a rapid reaction element staged deeper underground, reachable by the cargo lift or by foot through the southern tunnel complex. The runner who'd escaped south would reach them within minutes, if he hadn't already triggered an alert through a secondary communication system that the team hadn't located. The evidence window was closing. Everything from this point was time borrowed against the arrival of reinforcements that would shift the odds from favorable to lethal. Moran was inside the container barricade before the last echo died. She moved through the processing area with the focused attention of someone conducting an inventory under deadline, which, functionally, she was. Document everything. Every crate, every label, every shipping code. Photograph the processing equipment's serial numbers. Pull the data cores from the inventory displays, transaction logs, shipping manifests, supplier records. Rook, secure the Cathari personnel. Zip them, move them to the North Gallery, keep them quiet. Tasev, rear security on the south access. If anything moves in those tunnels, I want to know about it before it knows about us. She worked alongside Denik, moving through the staging area with the systematic thoroughness of a forensic team and the speed of people who knew they were on a timer. 46 sealed transport crates, each one bearing labels in 3 encoding systems, Cathari commercial routing codes, Drethanni military logistics stamps, and a third cipher that used a symbol set Moran didn't recognize. The third would be the Syndicate's internal system. Fleet intelligence would crack it inside a week. When they did, They'd have a network map that stretched across 3 sectors and implicated supply chains, running through legitimate commercial infrastructure shipping companies, bonded warehouses, cargo handlers, customs brokers, and at least one fleet logistics depot that had been routing Syndicate product under military manifest numbers. Denik photographed each crate from 3 angles. Moran pulled the data cores from the holographic inventory system, 3 crystal matrices, each one the size of her thumb, each one containing the transaction history that would connect the hub's physical inventory to the financial network that funded it. She slotted them into the portable compression unit alongside the photographic evidence. Behind the centrifuges, Moran noticed something that changed the intelligence picture. One of the crates in the staging area, crate 17, third row, right side, wasn't sealed with the same bonding compound as the others. It was taped. She pulled the tape, opened the lid, and looked inside. Not narcotics, weapons components, disassembled pulse rifle receiver assemblies, packed in anti-static foam with Drethanni military markings that had been partially filed off but were still legible under the right light. Military-grade weapons, diverted from a legitimate supply chain, being moved through the narcotics distribution network. The Syndicate wasn't just running drugs. They were running arms. The hub was dual purpose, and both were capital offenses under coalition law. She photographed the contents of crate 17, resealed it, and kept moving. The discovery didn't surprise her. It confirmed a hypothesis she'd been building since Sulan's initial intelligence report. A distribution network this sophisticated, with this much infrastructure investment, with connections to military logistics chains and government personnel, was never going to limit itself to a single product line. Criminal organizations followed the same economic logic as legitimate corporations: diversify revenue streams, leverage existing distribution infrastructure across multiple product categories, and use the profits from one line to fund the expansion of another. The Syndicate wasn't a narcotics operation that happened to move weapons. It was a logistics enterprise that moved whatever generated the highest margin relative to risk, and weapons components generated very high margins indeed. The receiver assemblies in crate 17 represented approximately 800,000 credits at military procurement rates. On the gray market, disassembled and untraceable, they were worth 3 times that. On the black market, delivered to non-state actors who couldn't purchase through legitimate channels, the multiplier was closer to 10. Moran had done the math because Moran always did the math. Numbers were the vocabulary of institutional accountability, and she intended to speak it fluently when the investigation began. She found something else behind the processing station. A locked storage locker, smaller than the cargo crates, made from military-grade alloy. Inside, personnel files, physical documentation handwritten on pressed fiber sheets in Cathari script, the old-fashioned kind that couldn't be hacked because it had never been digitized. Names, addresses, payment records, operational assignments. The names on the sheets would include customs officers, provincial officials, logistics coordinators, and at minimum one coalition advisory element liaison officer, whose salary from the Syndicate was itemized in careful notation alongside their official government compensation. When fleet investigators cross-referenced these records against the advisory element's personnel roster, someone's career was going to end in a way that no amount of jurisdictional ambiguity could soften. Moran photographed every page, 37 sheets both sides. On the hub's far wall, behind a magnetic tumbler security cage, a bank of communication equipment sat blinking. Moran gripped the cage door, braced her foot against the wall, and pulled. The hinges tore free. Human grip strength at peak exertion, roughly 400 pounds of force through the hand and forearm. The cage was rated for 150. The math was not close. She powered down every transceiver, one by one. The hub was now deaf and mute, cut off from the Syndicate's off-world infrastructure. from the logistics coordinators who managed the shipping routes, from the financial apparatus that converted raw precursor compound into credits that flowed through 18 shell accounts across 3 sovereign jurisdictions. Dennick compressed the intelligence package, everything, route a burst transmission to fleet headquarters through the advisory element's comm array, use Major Yorth's encryption codes. Dennick looked up. His codes, he didn't authorize this. He declined to participate. He didn't prohibit action. When fleet headquarters receives intelligence through an advisory element's official encryption, they're obligated to open a formal investigation. Yorth's name on the routing makes it official, whether he intended it to or not. She didn't blink. Use his codes. Dennick returned to work. He understood. Moran had constructed a chain of institutional accountability before the first shot, before the ridgeline, before the drainage channel, before Yorth's 11 minutes of jurisdictional deflection. She'd seen the architecture of inaction, and she'd built a structure that made inaction impossible to maintain. The intelligence package, routed through Yorth's encryption, would land on desks that couldn't ignore it. And Major Yorth, who had spent 11 days cultivating plausible deniability, would discover that a Marine sergeant had welded his name to a success so complete that denying involvement would require him to explain why he'd possessed actionable intelligence and sat on it. This was what it looked like when a human Marine sergeant decided something was going to happen. Not rage, not heroics, just the quiet, procedural construction of inevitability. Sergeant Tasev from the South Access. Movement, deep tunnels south-southeast, multiple thermal signatures, organized formation, closing at assault pace. Numbers 25 plus, Drethanni heavy based on thermal mass. Single file through the lower choke points, but they're moving fast, 3 minutes, maybe 4. 25. The Syndicate's reserve. A Drethanni reaction force of 25 was a combat formation organized, equipped, and conditioned for exactly this scenario. They would have squad leaders. They would have heavy weapons. They would know the tunnel layout, the access points, the choke points, and the dead ends. 4 Marines against 25 pit-bred assault troops in a tunnel network. The enemy knew better than the team currently occupying it. The numbers didn't favor a sustained defense, but they didn't need to. Moran needed 3 things: the intelligence package transmitted, the physical evidence denied to the Syndicate, and her team extracted alive. She had a plan for all 3. Dennick, status on transmission. 60 seconds to compression and burst. Rook, release the Kethari prisoners. All of them. Point them north and tell them to run. I don't want non-combatants in what happens next. Rook crossed to the north gallery where the 9 surviving Kethari enforcers sat in a line against the wall, their wrists zip-tied in front of them, their faces displaying the full spectrum of post-combat emotional response. He cut the ties one by one, speaking in simple trade speak. North, up, out, go. They went, 9 Kethari enforcers scrambling north through the gallery. They'd find the surface. They'd scatter into the market district. And they'd talk. They'd tell anyone who'd listen what had happened in the hub. 4 humans. No armor heavier than hard plate. No support. No authorization. And they'd taken the entire facility apart in the time it took to eat a meal. The stories would spread through Kesharath's underworld economy. And by morning, the Syndicate's remaining personnel in the valley would know that their operation hadn't been disrupted by a military strike force. It had been dismantled by a Marine sergeant and 3 enlisted personnel who decided it was going to happen, and then made it happen with the same procedural efficiency they'd applied to cleaning their weapons afterward. The talking was part of the plan. Reputation was a weapon that cost nothing to maintain and everything to rebuild once broken. Moran moved to the processing station. The atmospheric regulators hummed at their calibrated frequency. She studied them for 3 seconds, running the chemistry, oxygen concentration, precursor volatility, ignition threshold, atmospheric volume, available accelerant. She turned the regulators off, all four. Then she opened the ventilation vanes, heavy mechanical louvers set into the gallery walls, connected to surface shafts that drew fresh air from the valley above. Moran cranked them to maximum. Surface air oxygen-rich, 21% O2 concentration from a Deathworld atmosphere flooded into the processing area. She pulled 2 thermite igniters from the demolition kit. Standard field-expedient incendiary devices, magnesium iron oxide cores packed in ceramic housings with adjustable delay fuses. She set both to 60 seconds. She placed them on the stone floor directly beside the open containment trays, close enough that the thermite's 3,000-degree combustion would be in direct contact with the volatile precursor compound when the fuses burned down. She activated both, watched the delay indicators begin their slow pulse, and stepped back. The chemistry was simple. The precursor compound at ambient oxygen concentration was stable. At elevated oxygen, it became progressively more volatile. At approximately 26% atmospheric oxygen, any ignition source above 500 degrees would trigger a cascading exothermic reaction across the full volume of exposed material. Thermite burned at 3,000 degrees. The margin was not close. Denik. Done. Package transmitted. Fleet acknowledgement pending. Storm drain, all of you. Now, Tasev first, then Rook, then Denik. I'll hold the south access. They moved without argument. There was nothing to argue about. The order was clear. The logic was sound. And the team operated on a trust framework that had been built through 8 months of shared deployments and tested under fire at Vashran, at the corridor sweep, at the forward observation post on Orvan 3, where a routine patrol had turned into a 72-hour defensive engagement. And Moran had kept the team alive through 2 nights of contact by making decisions that were always correct and never dramatic. The team trusted Moran the way structural engineers trusted load-bearing calculations, not because she was charismatic, not because she inspired devotion, but because her judgment had been tested against reality repeatedly, and reality had never found a flaw. Moran took the rear position at the south access, weapon up, watching the approaching lights of the reaction force in the tunnel. The igniters were counting. 54 seconds remaining. The oxygen was flooding. The 60 liters of precursor in the open containment trays were absorbing it, the volatile threshold approaching with the same unhurried inevitability that characterized everything Moran did. The first weapon lights appeared around the last bend, bright, white, mounted on weapon rails, sweeping the tunnel in tactical search patterns. Behind the lights, the thermal mass of 25 bodies compressed the tunnel's air temperature upward by a detectable fraction. Moran could feel it, the faint warmth on her face that meant a lot of large, hot-blooded organisms were approaching at speed, in an enclosed space. The lead Drethanni came around the bend at a dead run, weapon up, firing from the hip as he moved. His rounds hit the stone wall 3 meters above Moran's position, the margin of error from hip firing at a sprint. He was fast. He was aggressive. He was exactly what pit-bred conditioning produced, a being who solved problems by running at them and applying force. Moran was not panicking. She was kneeling behind a support column with her weapon braced and her reticle settled on the center of the tunnel opening, waiting for the target to arrive at the point where she decided it would die. The Drethanni arrived. Moran fired. He dropped. The second pushed through immediately behind the first, stepping over the body without looking down, firing in the same direction. Moran had moved. She was 2 meters left. His fire went into empty stone. She fired twice. More behind him. The formation was compressing at the choke point, the rear elements pushing the front elements forward, the Drethanni assault doctrine working against itself, the way it always did in confined spaces. In the open, 25 charging Drethanni would overwhelm a 4-person position through sheer mass. In a tunnel that allowed 2 abreast, 25 Drethanni was 25 targets arranged in a line. The geometry was doing Moran's work for her. Humans had been defending choke points since the first one picked up a rock and stood in front of a cave, and in 300,000 years the principle hadn't changed. Make the space small enough and numbers stopped mattering. She fired methodically. One target, 2 rounds shift. Each engagement lasted less than a second. Her weapon moved. Her position didn't. A static, stable platform delivering precise fire into a corridor where the targets were organizing themselves into a queue. The Drethanni assault doctrine was built on the assumption that an attacking force's aggression and mass could overwhelm any defensive position if the attack was pressed with sufficient commitment. It was a doctrine developed in fighting pits, refined in arena combat, and exported across 3 sectors by Drethanni military contractors who sold their services on the reputation of their species' ferocity. In the pits, it worked. In arena combat, it worked. In a limestone tunnel 7 meters wide, where the targets had to approach single file through a choke point defended by a human marine who could place every round within a 2-centimeter circle at 60 meters, while maintaining a heart rate that most galactic species associated with sleep. It did not work. It produced casualties at a rate that would have caused any species with a less rigid command structure to break and withdraw. The Drethanni did not break. They did not withdraw. They pressed the attack because their doctrine said to press the attack, and they died because pressing the attack was exactly what Moran's position was designed to make them do. 40 seconds on the igniters. A Drethanni made it through a big one, broader across the shoulders than the others, his dark-scaled hide marked with the ritual scarring of a senior pit fighter. He charged with his weapon, firing continuously, the round sweeping the access point in a tight arc. Moran had moved. His saturation pattern hit the position she'd been in 4 seconds ago. She shot him center mass. His torso plating was thicker, the round hit, and he absorbed it, his stride unbroken. Her second round found the gap below his weapon arm. He folded at the waist, sliding forward 2 meters before stopping. 7 Drethanni down in the choke, 18 more still in the tunnel. 30 seconds. She could smell the change. The atmospheric oxygen concentration was climbing past the refinement window and entering the volatility range. The precursor compound in the open trays was changing state, molecule by molecule, from a manageable industrial chemical to something that existed on the edge of a thermodynamic cliff. 10 seconds on the igniters. The thermite cores would be glowing now, their filaments heating toward the activation temperature that would convert them from inert cylinders into 3,000-degree ignition sources, sitting next to 60 liters of compound that was begging for a reason to become energy. She fired 3 more rounds into the tunnel, not aimed, just noise, the auditory equivalent of a locked door that bought another 2 seconds of hesitation. Then she turned and ran. The drainage channel. Up. Wet stone. Her boots gripping, her legs driving, her cardiovascular system performing at the level it had been designed for over 300,000 years of running from things and toward things, and through things that should have killed the species and didn't. The detonation came as a compression wave, first a wall of displaced air that shoved up the drainage channel and hit her between the shoulder blades hard enough to stagger her forward. Then the sound, a deep, physical thump that she felt in her sternum and her teeth and the bones of her skull. Stone dust cascaded from the ceiling. The drainage water sloshed against the walls in confused waves. Behind her, in the mining gallery, 60 liters of solvent stage compound ignited. The thermite cores had reached activation temperature and put 3,000 degrees into a chemical system that had crossed its volatility threshold seconds earlier. The reaction was not gradual. It was not contained. It was an atmospheric conflagration that consumed the processing area in a single expanding wavefront of heat and pressure, vaporizing the containment trays, detonating the residual chemicals in the centrifuge lines, and turning the 46 sealed cargo crates into fuel for a fire that would burn until there was nothing left to burn. The pressure wave shot through the tunnel network like a fist through a pipe, slamming blast doors that hadn't been closed in years, collapsing weakened tunnel sections where the limestone had been thinned by decades of mineral extraction, and turning the lower tunnel complex into an oven that would reach temperatures sufficient to melt the Syndicate's communication equipment, fuse the cargo containers into slag, and reduce every piece of physical evidence in the gallery to its component elements. The fire would burn for hours. The tunnels would channel it, focus it, feed it with the drafts that the ventilation system, now running at maximum with nobody alive to turn it off, continued to push into the galleries. It was not an explosion. It was an erasure. The concussive wave shot up the drainage channel and caught Moran between the shoulder blades. She staggered, caught herself on the channel wall with one hand, and kept running. Behind her, the tunnel was full of heat and displaced air, and the distant, muffled sound of a facility being erased from the inside out. The stone walls of the drainage channel radiated absorbed heat against her back as she climbed, her legs driving through the burn of sustained exertion, her lungs pulling air that tasted of chemical combustion and hot limestone. They emerged from the culvert into the valley's late afternoon light. Moran's team was at the ridgeline deck with the portable transmitter balanced on a flat rock, Tasev covering the culvert exit with his weapon steady and his breathing undisturbed. The sun was low, throwing long ridge shadows across the slope. Below, a column of black smoke punched through the mining gallery's ventilation shafts, 3 separate columns from 3 separate shafts, merging into a single thick pillar that climbed into the still air and spread at altitude into a dark, flat canopy that would be visible from orbit. Denik, confirm fleet acknowledgement. Confirmed, priority flag accepted, investigation routing initiated. Moran sat on the ridge and drank from her canteen, warm water polymer taste. She drank it without expression. Her hands were steady, her breathing was even, her heart rate was back to 72. Rook sat beside her, watching the smoke. Yorth will be furious. Yorth will be the credited commander of a successful interdiction operation. Fleet will see his codes on the intelligence package. He'll receive a commendation and a service notation that says he identified and eliminated a major distribution hub in contested border space. His career will prosper. And if he pushes back, then he explains why his advisory element sat on actionable intelligence for 11 days while a Marine fire team did the work in one evening. She capped the canteen. He won't push back. Rook thought about that. He was 22 years old and he'd been a Marine for 3 of those years. He understood tactics, weapons systems, fire and movement doctrine, and the practical mechanics of small unit operations in hostile environments. What he was still learning, what Moran was teaching him without ever framing it as instruction, was the institutional dimension. The understanding that combat operations existed inside bureaucracies, legal frameworks, career structures, and political ecosystems that shaped what was possible as surely as terrain and enemy disposition did. Moran operated in all of those dimensions simultaneously. She fought the engagement with weapons, and she fought the institution with paperwork, and both campaigns were planned with the same cold precision. The weapons components in Crate 17, Rook said. That changes the scope. Narcotics interdiction is one thing. Arms trafficking is different jurisdiction, different authority level, different set of people who have to answer questions. Moran nodded. The weapons components elevate it from a border enforcement matter to a strategic security concern. Different investigation track, different oversight committee, different consequences for the people whose names are on those personnel files. She paused. It also means Yorth's advisory element wasn't just overlooking narcotics. They were overlooking weapons diversions from military supply chains. That's not political sensitivity. That's dereliction at best and complicity at worst, and the Inspector General's office will make that distinction for him. You planned for this. I planned for the possibility. The intelligence suggested narcotics. I allowed for the probability that a distribution network this large would diversify. Criminal organizations that survive long enough to build underground processing facilities don't survive by running a single product line. She looked at the smoke. Module 9, Advanced Intelligence Analysis, Threat Network Mapping and Convergent Criminal Enterprise Theory. I haven't taken Module 9. You will. Rook filed that. He filed most of what Moran said, in the same mental archive where he kept weapons specifications, terrain analysis techniques, and the other accumulating data of a young Marine's professional education. He was beginning to understand that Moran's competence wasn't a single skill, it was a system. A network of interconnected capabilities that ranged from the tactical to the institutional, from the physical to the analytical, from the immediate to the strategic. She could shoot, move, and communicate with the best operators he'd ever seen. She could also read a financial report, map a criminal network, draft a legal brief, and navigate the political landscape of a multi-species advisory element with the same cold precision she applied to a fire and movement drill. The human Marine Corps didn't produce specialists. It produced generalists whose breadth of capability was so wide that it looked, to species who organized their military personnel into narrow functional categories, like something that shouldn't exist. Tasev was already breaking down his optic, sliding the components into their padded case with the practiced economy of a man who could field strip and reassemble every piece of equipment he carried in the dark, underwater, under fire, or all three simultaneously. Denik verified the transmission log, cross-referencing the fleet acknowledgement codes against the standard confirmation matrix. Rook performed a function check on his weapon, cleared the chamber, and began the methodical process of accounting for every round he'd expended, not because regulations demanded it, though they did, but because knowing exactly how many rounds you'd fired and where each one had gone was the difference between a clean after-action report and the kind that ended careers. The team packed out quietly, methodically, with the professional economy of people who understood that the operation wasn't over until the gear was clean, the weapons were maintained, the ammunition was accounted for, and the paperwork was filed to standards that would survive review by lawyers, ethicists, and the particular species of bureaucrat whose entire function was finding things to be unhappy about. Moran led them along the ridge toward the extraction point. She walked at a steady pace 5 kilometers per hour, the speed she could maintain for 20 hours without stopping, the speed that the human body had been optimized for over millions of years of persistence hunting on the African savanna, the speed that had allowed her ancestors to chase down prey that was faster in the sprint but slower in the marathon. The Drethanni could outrun a human over 50 meters. No Drethanni alive could outrun a human over 50 kilometers, and the gap between those two facts was the gap between a species that evolved to fight and a species that evolved to endure. Weapons slung across her chest, eyes moving across the terrain with the automatic vigilance of someone for whom situational awareness wasn't a skill, but a state of being. She scanned because she was alive, and alive meant scanning, and she would scan until she stopped being alive, which wasn't in her plans for today. The ridgeline terrain was broken limestone with scattered scrub vegetation, the kind of ground that turned ankles and concealed hazards in the long shadows of the setting sun. Moran's feet found stable purchase on every step without conscious input. The proprioceptive system that had carried her down a wet drainage channel at a sprint now, performing the equally complex but less dramatic task of navigating uneven ground at a walking pace, while her conscious mind processed operational data, planned the extraction sequence, and composed the opening paragraph of the after-action report she would write in the transport. The sun dropped behind the far ridge, the valley filled with long shadows. The smoke from Kesharath caught the last light and turned copper. 3 columns merged into one, rising straight and still in the windless air. It would burn for hours. Moran estimated the fire would reach the Syndicate's secondary storage areas within 2 hours and the lower tunnel network within 4. By morning, the entire subsurface infrastructure would be a system of smoke-blackened voids containing nothing but ash and the fused remnants of equipment that had once been worth more than the town above it. The extraction point was a flat clearing on the ridge's western slope, 2 kilometers from the town, marked by a chemical beacon Moran had planted during her reconnaissance. The transport, a coalition light utility craft with military markings and diplomatic clearance codes, was there, ramped down, engines at idle, the crew chief standing at the top of the ramp with the expression of someone who'd been told to wait for a fire team, and was now watching 4 dust-covered Marines emerge from the darkness, trailing the faint smell of ozone, narcotics residue, and thermite. Moran walked up the ramp without looking back. The crew chief started to speak. He was Veteran, young, a logistics specialist who'd probably never been within 10 kilometers of a firefight. He started to ask about the smoke visible from the cockpit, about the seismic event that had registered on the transport's ground contact sensors at 1847 hours. Moran looked at him. The look contained nothing hostile. It was simply the look of a person who had completed a significant task and was now transitioning to the administrative phase. It was the look of someone who had absolutely no interest in explaining what had happened to a logistics specialist on a diplomatic transport. The crew chief closed his mouth and returned to his station. He would file his own report later, noting the fire team's return time, their equipment condition, and the anomalous seismic reading that the transport sensors had registered at 1847 hours. His report would include the observation that the fire team sergeant had declined to provide a verbal briefing on the mission profile. It would not include the observation that the sergeant's eyes, when she looked at him, had contained the particular quality of focused emptiness that he'd seen in documentaries about apex predators, the look of an organism that assessed everything in its visual field for threat potential and relevance, and having found neither, simply moved on. He didn't include that observation because he didn't have the vocabulary for it. He was a logistics specialist. His professional language covered cargo manifests, fuel calculations, and maintenance schedules. It did not cover the look in a Deathworld Marine's eyes after she'd spent 47 minutes dismantling a criminal infrastructure that 3 governments had spent a year pretending didn't exist. Denik handed her the full receipt. Fleet had flagged the package for priority analysis. Investigation routing was confirmed, and the advisory element, Major Yorth's advisory element, with his encryption codes on the header, was on record as the originating source. The receipt also included an automated acknowledgement from the Coalition Inspector General's office, which had been copied on the routing per standard protocol for intelligence packages flagged with a narcotics interdiction code. When they opened the package, they'd find 46 crate manifests, 3 encoding systems, personnel files naming Syndicate operatives embedded in allied government structures, and photographic evidence of military weapons components being trafficked alongside narcotics through a distribution hub that had operated for a year under the collective gaze of 3 governments who'd found it more convenient not to look. She sat in the jump seat, leaned her head against the bulkhead and closed her eyes, not to sleep, to process. She ran the operation in sequence, a mental replay that checked each phase against the plan and cataloged every deviation for the after-action report. Ridgeline contact, 2 shooters eliminated in coordinated fire, no delay. Sensor detection in drainage channel, operational compromise acknowledged, tempo increased. Guard junction, 6 hostiles, not 4 deviation noted. Hub assault, 18 hostiles, not the 12 to 15 projected. 8 Drethanni, not 6. 3 heavy weapons, not 2. The intelligence had been incomplete. The team had adapted. Deviation absorbed. Evidence collection. 46 crates documented. 3 encoding systems captured. Weapons components in crate 17 photographed. Communication equipment secured and disabled. Data cores pulled. 37 pages of personnel files photographed. Complete. Intelligence package transmitted through Yorth's encryption. Inspector General's office auto-copied. The weapons components elevated the case from border enforcement to strategic security. The personnel files implicated at least one member of the advisory element's liaison staff. By morning, the investigation would have its own momentum. By the end of the week, the investigation would have its own staff. By the end of the month, the Syndicate's distribution network across 3 sectors would be mapped, documented, and systematically dismantled by people who sat at desks and read reports that a Marine sergeant had written in the jump seat of a diplomatic transport while her team slept around her. Complete, every phase accounted for, every deviation documented, every round expended matched to a target and a timestamp, the after-action report would be airtight. It would be the kind of document that investigators read with the uncomfortable realization that the person who'd written it had anticipated the investigation before the first shot was fired, and had structured the entire operation to produce evidence that would survive judicial scrutiny. Moran didn't fight and then document. She documented as she fought, because documentation was part of the operation, and the operation included everything that happened after the last round was fired: the investigation, the review, the institutional consequences that would ripple outward from Kesharath through the advisory element, through the coalition's border enforcement apparatus, through the 3 governments whose personnel had been named in 37 pages of handwritten records. The transport hummed. Outside, the contested border between the Veshran and Kethari territories stretched in every direction: frontier towns built on commerce that nobody wanted to examine, transit corridors where cargo moved under manifest numbers that didn't match their contents, underground economies operating on the assumption that nobody was watching, nobody was coming, and nobody would ever care enough to do what Moran and her team had just done. The assumption was wrong. It had always been wrong. It was wrong in Kesharath, and it was wrong in every frontier settlement from the inner colonies to the border marches, in every transit hub where cargo manifests didn't match contents, in every underground facility that operated on the same comfortable fiction, that the systems designed to stop them were either too slow, too bureaucratic, too risk-averse, or too corrupt to act. The fiction had a name in the intelligence community. They called it Deathworld blindness, the cognitive bias that caused galactic institutions, criminal organizations, and military planners to consistently underestimate the capabilities, persistence, and sheer operational range of a species that had been classified as a Category 7 threat, and then promptly filed in the same mental category as any other minor military power with more aggression than resources. The filing was the error. The Category 7 designation wasn't a measure of military capability. It was a measure of biological capability, the assessment of what an organism from a planet with 10 times the standard model predator density, 3 times the geological instability, and an atmosphere aggressive enough to oxidize most construction metals could do when it decided that something needed to be done. Military capability was equipment and doctrine and logistics and funding. Biological capability was the substrate underneath all of it, the engine that the equipment was bolted to, and the engine determined the ceiling. The fiction persisted, because most of the galaxy's enforcement apparatus was staffed by beings like Major Yorth career officers whose training had taught them to weigh political risk against operational gain, and whose instinct was to avoid action when action could be avoided. The Syndicate's entire business model was predicated on the reasonable expectation that the systems designed to stop them would choose not to. And for a standard year, the expectation had been correct. It was correct until a Marine sergeant from a Category 7 Deathworld, a planet whose biosphere had produced organisms so adaptable, so persistent, and so aggressively competent that the galactic classification system had to invent a new tier to accommodate them, sat in a briefing room and listened to an 11-minute explanation of why nothing could be done, and decided that the explanation was insufficient, not wrong. Moran didn't think in terms of right and wrong when it came to operational decisions. She thought in terms of sufficient and insufficient. Yorth's justification for inaction was technically valid and practically insufficient, and the gap between those two things was where Moran operated. The gap between what the rules allowed and what the situation required. The gap where compliance ended and competence began. Sergeant Aya Moran finished her ration, tucked the wrapper into her vest pocket, and opened her eyes. She pulled Dennick's datapad from the storage net, opened a blank document, and began writing the after-action report. She typed the way she did everything steadily, without pause, without revision, each sentence complete before the next one began. The report would be 3 pages. It would cover the intelligence receipt, the operational decision matrix, the tactical approach, each engagement phase with round counts and timestamps, the evidence collection methodology, the atmospheric ignition and its tactical rationale, and the extraction timeline. It would not contain adjectives. It would not contain opinions. It would not contain the words heroic, brave, exceptional, or any of the other terms that post-action reviews use to describe operations that succeeded through preparation rather than luck. It would contain times, coordinates, round counts, environmental data, intelligence assessments, and the names of every hostile combatant who could be identified from the personnel files she'd photographed. It would be the kind of document that read like a maintenance log for a piece of industrial equipment, because that was what Moran considered operational documentation to be. A record of inputs, processes, outputs, and deviations, written in language precise enough to survive translation into any legal or administrative framework that might subsequently be applied to it. The report would be filed through official channels. It would become part of the permanent record, indexed and archived and accessible to every investigator, adjudicator, and historian who would ever have cause to ask what happened in Kesharath on this date. And somewhere in that permanent record, between the round counts and the coordinates and the flat, declarative sentences, a reader who knew what to look for would find the answer to a question that Major Yorth had never asked, and Moran had never needed to speak aloud. What happens when you give a Deathworld Marine a soft mandate mission, and then tell her the mandate doesn't cover the one thing that matters? She does it anyway, she does it quietly, she does it right, and she files the paperwork before breakfast.